Can anyone hear me? It's dark. It's so dark.
From the very beginning of Chapter 1, we've been told about the Knight, a being with the power to open dark fountains and destroy the world. The king speaks of them with respect, admitting his purpose is to help them plunge the world into darkness. The queen, on the other hand, calls them by their full title, the Roaring Knight. We even see a distorted glimpse of them opening a new fountain. She acknowledges their power, and just like the king, seeks to further their goals. Even Jebel and Spamton reference them. But that leaves one question. Who is the Knight? Well, until recently, there was no answer. But lucky for you, I have it. The bat, the antlers, the connection to Carol and the bunker, the musical leitmotif and their battle theme, the very same one that was hidden for years on a website that seemed totally irrelevant. Everything points to one person, because the real question isn't who the Knight is, but why they are the Knight. And to answer that question, and to understand why her disappearance is the key to everything, we first need to understand who she is. Des Holiday. Des is the eldest daughter of the Holiday family, and technically she has never appeared in the game, technically. Everything we know about her comes from the Holiday family, which includes Rudy, the father. He's laid up in the hometown hospital with some kind of strange illness. But in Chapter 2, we can find him playing console games with Noelle. And in Chapter 4, we see him at the church service, even though Toriel says he needs to head back to the hospital to rest. Then there's Carol, the mother. She's also the mayor of hometown, and you should know she has a somewhat suspicious connection to Chris. On the weird route in Chapter 4, while Sans and Toriel are making a whole lot of noise, Chris gets a call from Carol telling them that Noelle is hoping to see them tomorrow at the town festival. And all of this brings us to Noelle, the younger daughter. In the first chapter, she seemed like just a side character, but in the second, she becomes part of our team, and we can manipulate her into doing some pretty disturbing things. This is how we can start, or not start, the Snowgrave, or Weird Route. A sort of genocide run involving a thorny ring and lots of snow. These decisions have huge consequences, especially in Chapter 4, where we either see her as a normal girl who invites us to her house, or we use her to put that thorny ring back on. But we'll dive deeper into that route in its own dedicated video someday. Des, on the other hand, is mentioned in several of Noelle's flashbacks, where she says they loved spending time together on adventures with Chris and Azriel, showing just how close the Dreamer and Holiday families used to be. And Tenna, the boss of Chapter 3, directly mentions Des in his game show minigames, specifically during the rock and roll segment. He reminds Chris how they used to sing and rehearse songs in front of the TV, while Noelle's sister played the guitar, which, as we're about to see, connects directly to the Find Her theme, leading us to ask, where is she? The first possibility is simple. She's gone. Des died, and that's why everyone talks about her with such a sense of nostalgia. That's why her room is left untouched in her honor and memory. However, there are tons of clues, both in and out of the game, that suggest Noelle's sister hasn't kicked the bucket just yet. If we visit the police station at the end of Chapter 2, after Undyne runs off to catch some escaped criminals, we can read a poster about Asgore's resignation from the police force following a certain disappearance. This carries a lot more weight when we remember that Asgore and Rudy, Des's dad, used to get along really well, until their relationship was likely severed by his daughter's disappearance. And there's a clue outside the game that definitely confirms Des is missing. There's a website called the Spamton Sweepstakes. I'm sure many of you already know it since it was the only piece of lore we had for years, and you'll know it served as a charity drive for the Child's Play charity, and that Toby, obviously, used it to hide several links full of secrets and details about Deltarune Chapters 3, 4, and 5. Among these links, there's one that takes us to a dark page with a red guitar, the same one we find in Des's room. Clicking on it plays an audio track called findher.oog. Furthermore, Chapter 2's track 30, titled Lost Girl, which plays specifically when Noelle appears, sounds strangely similar. These details, from the disappearance in town to the audio tracks connected to the guitar in Des's room, clearly tell us that she is the lost girl who's still alive, waiting to be found. So it's time to talk about someone who took it upon themselves to find us, the other side of the coin. The Roaring Knight. According to the Deltarune prophecy, the Knight is a powerful being who, just like a lightner, can use enough determination to stab the earth and create a dark fountain, giving life to a new dark world. Clear examples of lightners are Chris, Susie, and even Noelle, beings from the light world who can act, attack, or use magic. The same applies to the Knight, who has various abilities and is therefore a lightner, not a darkner like Rousey or any being native to a dark world. So this means both our heroes and the Knight can cover the world in darkness with the fountains they create, unleashing chaos and the Titans, enormous beings made of darkness with no control over their actions, spelling the end of life as we know it. However, not all is lost. Gerson, a wise turtle we first met in Undertale, tells us more about the prophecy of the Deltarune, saying that the symbol of the 3 triangles and the winged circle represents the heroes and the angel who will free us from the darkness. But some believe this could also be the angel of death, a being of destruction looking to liberate us, in heavy air quotes, from this mortal coil. Getting back to the Roaring Knight, they are mentioned several times on our adventure. The queen talks about the origin of her world's dark fountain, the king says the knight gave them a new purpose, Jevo alludes to their existence, and Spamton acts super weird whenever he's asked about them. It was even believed that Chris themselves could be the Roaring Knight, since they can create fountains, though we had very little information at the time. But it wasn't until the end of chapter 3 that they finally made their first physical appearance. Their look is defined by thin arms and legs, and most notably a head with a very peculiar shape, one that resembles antlers. It might remind you of a certain member of the Holiday family. They have a tough black armor that looks like the darkness of the fountains themselves, with a skeletal frame underneath, leaving a bony waist exposed. They can manifest a weapon that at first looks like a baseball bat, but it soon morphs into a type of dark sword that they use for some of their attacks, which all consist of slashing, throwing stars, and summoning more swords. And if we're going to talk about the sword and armor, we have to consider one very important detail. Susie is able to break off a fragment of their weapon to analyze later, discovering that it's another shadow crystal, just like the ones from the previous secret bosses. This also gives Chris a new weapon, an empty fragment that cuts enemies very effectively with a bleed and shadow effect. Curiously, they can also zip around as a fast-moving sphere of matter, and if they start to get weak, they project a static effect that you can see after wearing them down in the fight. This is maybe a symbol of the strong connection between the dark world and the light world, and how they both affect the appearance and state of objects and people. And the prophecy wasn't exaggerating when it said they were powerful. They can defeat Susie and Rousey in a single blow, leaving them in critical condition. However, they don't seem to do much damage to Chris, which opens the door to a lot of questions. Which inevitably, and with all the clues on the table, leads us to ask, once and for all, why Des? There are a ton of details that connect Des to the Roaring Knight in some way, and a lot of them have to do with her appearance and personality. We can find most of these in the Holiday House, which Chris and Susie enter after the church service to work on a school project with Noelle. Among the various rooms in the home, we find the black door. Coincidence? I think not. That leads to Des's room. Let's start with the baseball bat leaning against a wall. It looks a bit beat up, which suggests that Des liked to play ball and her bat got damaged somehow. Also, if you look at her computer, you'll notice the mouse is on the left side of the monitor, which means Des is left-handed. With these two facts, we can go back to the knight's appearance and notice an interesting detail. The weapon they manifest initially takes the form of a bat, as if it were the very same one. Then there's a prophecy Rousey tells us about in chapter 3. He uses a chair as an example to explain how, when darkness gets darker than dark, it warps our perception of objects. That very same chair can also be seen distorted among the posters hanging in Des's closet. It's a clue for us, the player, that Des is in a place darker than dark, somewhere in the dark world. Another clue we can't ignore is the guitar in Des's room. Tucked inside is a note with the code 122 ? The same code that if we complete it with a 5, lets us open the bunker. What's more, the code is clearly meant to be 1225, but Chris doesn't let us finish reading it. It's because they don't want the player to find out what's hidden in there, which makes the possibility that they have a plan with the knight even more likely. And here's a fun fact, 1225 is part of Noelle's username, HolidayGirl1225, and is also a reference to Christmas, 1225. And while we're on the subject of fun facts, The creator of this video somehow predicted a year before the new chapters came out that the inside of the guitar would be important. That said, there are so many, and I mean so many more clues surrounding this number, like an Easter egg we can only access by using the code 1225 on a gacha machine, which takes us to a red dungeon holding some of the most interesting secrets and revelations. Or the secret dialogue with Asgard, where we discover he has a black shard, the same kind you can only get from the Roaring Knight. And in that same scene, the music that plays is The Distance Between the Two, which not only references the rift between Chris and their soul in this specific context, but it also uses the same leitmotif as Find Her and Lost Girl. This is a massive topic that deserves its own deep analysis, and that's exactly why I'm just mentioning it briefly. I'm planning for this to be a 3-part series, and I think this information, along with other things, deserves its own video where we can dive much deeper into its meaning for Des and the future of Deltarune. Now, with all this information on the table, it's practically impossible to ignore that one way or another, everything ends up revolving around Des and the Knight. And that's exactly why it's so important to analyze the battle. The Roaring Knight is known for showing our heroes no mercy, except for Chris. They're the only one of the 3 who gets a chance to recover and keep fighting. And if you manage to go through the entire fight without taking a single hit, a tiny detail happens that changes everything. Chris will cough. In response, the Knight gives a slight nod of their head, and on their very next turn, they launch the charge that leads to their final attack. This means they're coordinated, they're connected. Chris and the Knight are on the same page, and since Susie and Rousey are lasting too long, they both decide to just end the fight. After you defeat them, Susie rushes in trying to tackle them to the ground, but the Knight holds firm, causing a fragment of their sword to break off and fall to the floor along with a shadow crystal. Susie taunts them, saying they weren't all they were cracked up to be. The Knight's response? A single devastating blow that lays her out flat. They do the same to Rousey when he tries to heal her. But Chris? The Knight just touches their shoulder with the sword, forcing them to their knees before faking their own defeat. After that, the Knight tries to grab Toriel, but Susie, with her last breath, stops them. Suddenly spears appear, trying to strike the Knight, revealing the arrival of police officer Undyne in the Dark World. The Roaring Knight snatches her and escapes the Dark World, prompting Susie and Chris to give chase, accidentally ending up back in the Light World. Susie sees someone running in the distance, so they sprint to catch them, assuming it's the Knight with Undyne. They cut through the cathedral to head south of hometown and find themselves at the bunker, which violently slams shut. Furious, she starts pounding on the gate until a numeric panel is revealed with 3 symbols written above it: a pine tree, a police badge, and the Deltarune. These could represent citizens of hometown, the pine tree for Mayor Carroll, the police badge for Undyne, and the Deltarune most likely for Chris or the Angel, because Chris themselves decides to inspect the panel, and seconds later the door opens as if they were being invited to pass into this unknown dark world. All of this happens in chapter 3, and in the next, the Knight opens a dark fountain in the cathedral, and not only that, they are able to create a fountain inside another dark fountain, which causes a Titan to be born just as the prophecy foretold, making it clear they know exactly how the Dark Worlds work. But enough of that. It's time to analyze what makes Toby Fox's games truly stand out. The music. For anyone who doesn't know, a leitmotif is a recurring musical theme or a central motif often repeated in various art forms to emphasize something specific. In the case of Undertale and Deltarune, it's used for and when significant characters appear on screen. For example, the spider has an incredible theme, and we only see her once in the entire game. So, now that we know what a leitmotif is, let's listen closely for similarities in the music surrounding the Knight. But first, let's refresh our memory with the red guitar and Find Her, Des's main theme. Now a snippet from the Roaring Knight's main theme. And if you pay attention, you'll notice a direct reference to the music representing Des's disappearance in the music that plays against the Knight. Not to mention that Black Knife has a segment that, when played in reverse, hides a secret melody. You can pick out the same melody on any piano to hear it more clearly, and it bears a striking resemblance to the Lost Girl audio and its first 5 seconds. A fun fact, Lightner's Live has the Find Her leitmotif in one part of the song, and it's Chris who plays the melody with their guitar. If we overthink it a little, this could be interpreted as them being the one who's looking for Des. The idea gains even more weight when you consider Ralsei's lyrics, because I'm with you in the dark, with your heart as my mark, which says a lot on its own and is a direct reference to Don't Forget. Again, this is a topic for a video completely dedicated to Des, but I thought it was worth mentioning here. And now, with all this evidence, there should only be one possible path. Des is the Roaring Knight, unless she is not. I'm gonna be honest here. When I first planned out this theory, I was convinced there was no other option but Des being the knight. However, as I got deeper into the research, I discovered a connection that changed everything. And yes, I'm talking about Carol, Noelle and Des's mother, but not for the reasons everyone thinks. In fact, let's just jump right into it. At the end of chapter 4, Chris gets a phone call that appears as a creepy black text box, and a distorted voice says, Now at the end of the weird route, Chris gets another call, this time from Carol asking him to visit Noelle. This is especially suspicious because in both calls, someone is asking for a favor, which could very well be the same favor helping Noelle. Besides, why would the big reward for the Snowgrave route be a phone call from Carol? Clearly, Toby Fox's intention was for us to connect Carol with the knight, or at least with this mysterious entity. On top of that, in the Holiday family dining room table, there's a katana hanging on the wall, a weapon that looks similar to the one the knight uses. Not to mention, Carol's antlers are a perfect match for the Roaring Knight's antlers. The problem, for me at least, was that this wasn't quite a smoking gun. It could all just be a coincidence, right? Well, after racking my brain a bit, I found something that truly changes everything. In Noelle's house, right after she and Susie leave the room, Chris makes a phone call. A voice, the exact same voice from the end of chapter 4, with the same text box, says the following. Well, when you rejoin Susie and Noelle, the latter tells Asgore not to worry, her mom will be home in several more hours like she usually is. But Carol was already at the door, and she walked in knowing Susie had the guitar in her hands. In other words, Chris definitely called Carol to tell her that Susie was messing with the guitar. Furthermore, she storms into the house angry because she already knew what was happening thanks to Chris, who, by the way, is the only one she treats with any kindness compared to everyone else. She even tells Asgore to leave. And to top it all off at the Holiday house, Carol Holiday's room is usually inaccessible. However, we can actually get in there after Chris rips out their soul and explore through the air vents. Inside, we get a glimpse of a bed, a corkboard, and a nightstand with a vase. Next to the table is an object that looks like the hilt of a sword, which data mining has confirmed is another katana, suggesting that Carol owns at least 2 of them. What's more, an unused sprite found in the game files shows her with a dark liquid, possibly blood, is staining her face. But hold on, because we still haven't talked about the most important call of them all, which happens in the kitchen. This is where Carol, and yes, at this point I'm just gonna assume it's her, talks to Chris about the next dark fountain. In red letters, a message warns that Susie must not get the guitar, while a message in white text says a soul is needed, that without Chris's soul, nothing will be possible. Then it says the police officer's sacrifice will be next week, and what a coincidence that the Roaring Knight just happened to try and kidnap Undyne, the cop. Finally, it tells him to go to the church at night, which is exactly why Chris escapes their room at the end of chapter 4. This makes the theory that Carol is the Roaring Knight using her roars to search for Des make way more sense. and the power of a soul is necessary for all this, but we'll save that for a video completely dedicated to the topic. And let's not forget Noelle confirming her mother's obsession with hearts, and how Chris as a kid used to pretend to rip their heart out of their chest and chase her with it. Dialogue like that, at least to me, is no coincidence. It was very deliberately included. Now, you could argue that the calls don't have to be from the night. Maybe it's just Carol hiding her identity from the player for some reason, perhaps at Chris's request, which could be true, if it weren't for the massive coincidence that the knight is also allied with Chris. As we saw before, in the middle of the battle, if Rosé and Susie hold out for too long, Chris will cough and the knight responds with a slight nod before launching their final attack. They are definitely collaborating, and who else is Chris coordinating with? That's right, Carol Holiday. And if you're still not totally convinced, let me tell you about the hidden audio files found in chapters 1 and 2, where we could hear deaths lost in a dark place, with no idea how much time had passed. Well, for chapters 3 and 4, new audio files were released. We won't dive too deep into them because that deserves its own dedicated video on deaths, but I'll leave you with the most important part for this theory. This shows us two things. First, Des entered a dark world from her bedroom, right after going through the door, just like she says. That's why her door is black. It's a reference to the fact that at one point, it was a dark fountain, which Des might have opened by accident, or someone else did. And second, Des is still trapped in a place darker than dark, the game's code. She herself says she feels like it's been years this time, which means she's been there since chapters 1 and 2. The fact that these audio files are being revealed with each new chapter hidden in the code tells us that Des is still lost. She's still there, in the code, the only place we can get these audio files from. That's why she says she feels like someone is listening, because when we play them, we are that someone for her, and she hears that scratching noise, which is us digging through the code. And finally, it's time to address the last remaining but. Des is left-handed, and the knight holds their sword with their left hand, right? Well, even though it became a common belief, when they hold the sword in their left hand, it's actually because they're attacking us with their right hand, shooting energy or whatever that is. And when they strike with the sword, they switch it to their right hand and attack with the right hand. Not to mention the sword is exactly like the one in her home, and Noelle literally points out that it's her mom's sword, a completely unnecessary detail unless it was a subtle clue left by the game. So then why so many clues pointing to Des? Why create an entire website that revolved around her if she wasn't the Roaring Knight in the end? Because she is not the journey, she is the destination. Just like the One Ring in the Lord of the Rings drives the plot of all 3 movies because it has to be destroyed, spoilers by the way if you haven't seen a 20-year-old movie, Des functions as a MacGuffin in Deltarune. Her disappearance drives the quest for Chris, for Carol, the Roaring Knight, and in a different way for us. All while she acts as the catalyst for the conflict in the game's hidden story. Therefore, definitively, Des cannot be the Roaring Knight. She's still out there. And just like the song we found on the Spampton Sweepstakes website tells us, she's waiting to be found. Of course, this doesn't mean there aren't still a ton of questions about Des that we didn't dive into, like the possibility she might not be alive, or why we, as players, are the ones who motivate the weird route. And even if it's not Carol, the only other real possibility left is that she's controlling the night, because as we learn from Gersenboom, and just like in Undertale, when a monster dies and turns to dust, their remains are transferred into a cherished object. Which means, and this is a whole other video but I'm mentioning it now to cover all the bases, Des could have died, maybe inside a dark world, but her essence became imbued in an object, which was then able to gain its own consciousness and part of Des's. That's why I wanted to tell you that I've already got a series of at least 2 more videos planned out to explain and theorize about all that, including an exclusive video on the Knight and Carol, plus everything we know about the angel from the prophecy, whose identity, to me at least, is much clearer thanks to these chapters. Not to mention a ton of other ideas that I think are interesting and that you guys might love. It all depends on how much you support this video. For my part, I had an absolute blast making it, so don't forget to comment what you think. I always read them.